Let's get to our panel right now. Joining us in the studio is Afshin Molavi. He is a senior fellow at the Foreign Policy Institute at Johns Hopkins University. Also with us is Simon Marks. He's the president and chief correspondent for Feature Story News. From Beijing, we're joined by Qinduo Xu. He's a political analyst with China Radio International. And Lester Munson is a vice president with the BGR Group, a strategic consulting firm right here in Washington, D.C. Thanks to all of you. So, Lester, let me start with you. What do you make of it? This is unprecedented, isn't it? The United States, I think, the first time it is reneging on an agreement, on a deal.
Well, I think it's important to note, actually, the United States is not reneging on the agreement. What President Trump announced today in the context of saying he's not going to certify Iran compliance with the spirit of the deal actually changes nothing in the underlying Iran nuclear agreement. So if you thought this was President Trump fulfilling his promise to tear up the deal, it is not that at all. In fact, there's very few consequences from this action. More interesting is, as we were discussing here a little bit earlier, is the new administration plan for containing Iran in the Middle East, and also legislation that Senator Corker, who's the chair of the Foreign Relations Committee, announced that actually would, in fact, make an effort to extend the good parts of the Iran nuclear agreement for a much longer time frame than is currently written in the agreement.
But they would still be two separate deals, won't they, if that Corker legislation passes?
Well, it will drive a real dilemma for the international community in about 6 years. Right now, under the agreement, under the existing Iran nuclear agreement, Iran can begin using advanced centrifuges in about 6 years, in a few months. And it's at that point when the deal is no longer really that terrific for the United States. Right now, we have a pretty good deal. But in 6 years, once Iran can actually start a lot of its nuclear activities, the deal becomes not very good. What Senator Corker's legislation would do is reimpose sanctions on Iran if it starts using those centrifuges, which is how it gets the material for nuclear weapons. And that would be a real challenge to the international community. And frankly, if President Trump's going to be around for a second term, he's got 6 years to persuade his allies in China and Europe and Russia that this is in fact a good idea.
Simon, you want to say something?
Well, I mean, just, hang on a second. This is a man who went to every rally during last year's presidential election campaign, and in every speech before every crowd insisted this is the worst deal the United States has ever done, and he couldn't wait to get into office to shred it and tear it up. He repeated that in the speech that he made today about this being the worst deal imaginable, cast shame and opprobrium on Barack Obama for having dared to enact this deal and sign it. We heard in the speech about what a terrible actor on the world stage Iran is. I mean, he didn't quite use the phrase axis of evil, but he walked right up to it. It's a rogue state acting disgracefully on the world stage. And then he says he's not pulling out of the Iran deal. There's an enormous disconnect there between what he said and what he did. And if you're one of his core supporters out in Trump country who voted for him in part because you thought it was a terrible deal and you thought he was the man who was going to walk away from this, you must be very confused tonight.
Right, talking about confusion, Afshin, so Trump says he will not certify that Iran is in compliance with this deal, but he stopped short of actually scrapping it.
That's right. And what he did is President Trump, he hated this fact that every 90 days he had to certify this deal because, as Simon said, on the campaign trail, he would spend, quite a bit of time describing this deal as the worst deal ever, et cetera. So what he did here is he, in a sense, he said, well, I'm going to say that this deal is not within the spirit, but I'm not going to actually change the deal because guess what? If you scrap the deal, guess what might happen? You may have to renegotiate a new deal. And you don't want to get involved in that. But I think the larger point here is that while he's making this speech, a new strategy was also unveiled towards Iran. And that's really significant. If you want to see a difference between the Obama administration and the Trump administration on Iran, that's where it is. The strategy entails, according to the White House press statement, neutralizing Iran's aggression across the region, confronting the Revolutionary Guard. President has announced new Treasury sanctions on the Revolutionary Guard, which is a very important part of Iran's political system. And so that's where we need to be looking at going forward, because as both of my colleagues said, the deal is still alive.
Well, let me get some clarity on that. You say the deal is still alive. He sent this back to Congress.
Yes.
Okay. He has said that if Congress doesn't act, then the deal is dead.
Yeah.
So Congress has to act. If Congress acts, it is changing the terms of that deal. And Iran can rightfully say the United States is violating it.
Right, but the deal won't just die if Congress doesn't act, right? Because one, the president or the Congress will have to impose new sanctions, because that's Iran's trigger, right? New sanctions, Iran will say, okay, we're out of the deal now. And I think to some extent, that's something that President Trump would not mind. If Iran reacted to this aggressively and said, all right, well, we're going to step out of the deal now ourselves, because I don't think he wants to be the one that takes the United States out of this deal.
Okay, let me get Qinduo into this conversation, then I'll get to you, Simon. Qinduo, what is the Chinese view on what is taking place here?
Well, first of all, this is creating unnecessary uncertainty, unnecessary tension with Iran and also in this region. And secondly, I tend to disagree with our previous speakers about the fate of the deal. And seeing from Beijing, we don't understand clearly what's the true intention of the Trump administration and whether the Congress will work out a separate deal, will reimpose the sanctions, will simply kick it back to the White House, and then the deal will be dead probably. And so you see the similar concern from the Russian side, from the European powers over there. Obviously, I mean, this is an international agreement. This is endorsed by the UN resolution. This is not something you can simply walk away. I think this creates a lot of uncertainty, unnecessary uncertainty, I would say.
Simon?
Look, I agree entirely with what Qinduo said. This comes in the week when Donald Trump has announced that he's taking the United States out of UNESCO, the United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization. He's scrapped the proposed Trans-Pacific Partnership that was very attractive to many of America's partners in the Asia-Pacific region. We've had the Canadian Prime Minister here, Justin Trudeau, trying once again to salvage something out of the president's decision basically to throw the NAFTA, North American Free Trade Agreement, cards up into the air and see where they land. He keeps sending messages to his partners and to his challengers and rivals on the world stage that America's word is not necessarily its bond. And you would think that someone who has been steeped in the world of business, where your word has to be your bond, would understand that the same is true of international relations. I think what we're also witnessing here is division within the White House. We all know Donald Trump wants to scrap the Iran nuclear deal. He said it time and time and time again. But we also now know his own national security team, his Secretary of State, his National Security Advisor, his Defense Secretary, and his White House Chief of Staff all think that's a dreadful idea. So they put the arm on him. They persuaded him to dilute what he was planning to do. My guess is that pretty soon he'll be very unhappy about that decision.
Sorry, just to this point and to Qinduo's point about the uncertainty, what you need to look out for next is Secretary Mattis and Secretary Tillerson selling this new Iran strategy, because that's what people around the world are looking for. They're not looking for President Donald Trump's speeches in some respects or his tweets. They're looking for what the quote-unquote adults in the room to begin espousing this strategy.
Right, Lester, to the point about uncertainty and the concerns being expressed by U.S. allies around the world, has this hurt U.S. credibility?
Well, that's entirely possible, although, let's face it, in the last 9 months, U.S. credibility was reduced a great deal anyway. And I do think that you have to wonder about the application of what we're seeing with Iran to the North Korea situation, where the U.S. is engaged evidently in a good cop, bad cop strategy. I'm not sure how that's ever worked in international relations before, by the way, but engaged in a good cop, bad cop strategy with North Korea of threatening military action while at the same time trying to work a diplomatic or economic sanctions solution with China. Is that non-military solution going to be more or less likely because of the drum beating on Iran? I don't know the answer to that question. I suspect it's going to be harder to get to a good deal on North Korea because of this. But I do think it's important that we remember, for all of the shouting and all of the crazy language in the president's statement today and the reaction from some of his domestic opponents, he is still endorsing the deal. just as he did in April and July when he certified that Iran was complying, he's effectively staying in the deal now. So for all of the yelling and screaming, the U.S. remains an active participant in the joint, in the JCPOA, the nuclear deal with Iran.
Right, just on that point about negotiations with the DPRK, Qinduo, of course, China is involved very closely in those negotiations on the nuclear program being conducted by the DPRK. Does it now make it more difficult for China to negotiate with the DPRK? Because Kim Jong-un can just turn around and say, well, look, why should we negotiate when we have a country that might change its mind?
Well, that's right. I would say, from my understanding, I would say with certainty, I mean, Kim Jong-un would find it probably his opinions, his ideas would be hardened that, nuclear weapon is the only ensures the policy for the survival of his government, of course, himself. And secondly, he would say, hey, U.S. is not honoring its deal done by its previous administration. If I somehow worked very hard to reach a deal through peaceful means with the U.S., there's no way probably to make sure the next U.S. administration will honor the deal. So this also will create a lot of pressure on their side that to stay away from, say, peaceful talks, diplomatic means to solve this problem. And if there's a negotiation, they would say, no, there's no talk about my nuclear weapons program. So I think it is getting harder to bring the North Korean to the negotiation table.
Yeah, Lester?
I just want to make a quick point here that the Iran nuclear deal, much like the Paris Climate Agreement, was not a treaty. It was an executive agreement done by the president without the support of Congress. Right. So it is absolutely within bounds for the next president to withdraw from those agreements, as President Trump did on Paris, and as may happen eventually on the Iran deal.
Has that happened before in the United States?
That's an excellent question. I can't think of an example right now. I'm sure there, there's if you study treaties and international agreements, there's a book about this thick that's just the list of international agreements. It doesn't actually contain the language of them. There's a huge number of these things, but I think it points to the simple fact that there's not a huge amount of American domestic support for the Iran nuclear deal, just as there wasn't for the Paris Accord. So to say you can't just pull out, well, actually, the problem with those agreements is they're so weak. There's such weak support here that was exactly the risk the whole time.
Simon?
Iran and its reformers took a massive risk in engaging in this dialogue with the United States and other world powers. And the European Union ambassador has spent weeks crisscrossing the United States trying to remind the Trump administration and Americans that this is a multinational agreement. This isn't just America and Iran. If you're one of those reformers in Iran who spent months, years, trying to persuade the hardliners, don't worry, this is going to be good for us, we can trust them, it's okay, you tonight have got masses of egg on your face as a result of what President Trump has done today. Right. Let's ask ourselves, maybe somewhere in the DPRK, there's a young reformer who was thinking of edging towards Kim Jong-un and saying, maybe we should actually begin a conversation with the Americans. No reformer in North Korea, if there are any, would dream of now doing that based on what they have seen has happened to the reformers in Iran.
Right, there has been a response from the Iranians. Let's listen to the Iranian President, Hassan Rouhani.
Trump did not correctly study international law. How is it that a multilateral treaty adopted by the United Nations, originally a United Nations document, can be cancelled by a president alone? Trump apparently does not know that this is not a bilateral document between Iran and the United States, and he wants to do whatever he wants to do.
So, Afshin, if you look at this, over the last few decades, the United States has done its best to demonize the Iranians, to say that they were in violation of all kinds of international laws and agreements. Now, Iran can stand up and say, it's not us, it's them.
Yeah, they can. They certainly can. And, Hassan Rouhani is one of those figures who did expend a lot of political capital, as Simon noted, to get this deal. And, Anand, what's ironic here is that the deal is actually popular among the Iranian public. All polls indicate that. The regime is not popular among the Iranian public, right? So when you have, and the reason that the deal is popular is because Iranians want the same things anyone else in the world wants. They want better international integration, they want jobs, a better economy, and all of those things. And the hope was that this deal would bring that. So on the one hand, Donald Trump also spoke out to the Iranian people in his speech, right? And he said things like the regime oppresses you and it kills political prisoners and that sort. And all of that is true. But on the other hand, Donald Trump is banning Iranians with these travel bans, and also threatening a deal that many Iranians hope will reintegrate them into the world. So there's so many contradictions in this strategy that he's unveiled.
Right, and Lester, getting to the strategy that the United States is now opting against Iran, let's take a listen to what President Trump had to say.
The Revolutionary Guard is the Iranian supreme leader's corrupt personal terror force and militia. It has hijacked large portions of Iran's economy and seized massive religious endowments to fund war and terror abroad. This includes arming the Syrian dictator, supplying proxies and partners with missiles and weapons to attack civilians in the region, and even plotting to bomb a popular restaurant right here in Washington, D.C.
So, Lester, as Afshin pointed out, the new strategy that the administration has unveiled has been obscured by the nuclear deal and possible undermining of the nuclear deal. Could one affect the other? If they impose a new strategy on the Iranians, could it undermine that nuclear deal?
It's possible, but I think we should remember there's two. This is at least a two-way street. It's actually a multi-lane highway. And in addition to the U.S. having a new Iranian strategy, Iran itself is engaged in acts in the region that are of significance. It's engaged in ballistic missile testing and other things that are very provocative. Iran's role in the region is not a peacemaking one in the slightest. And frankly, aside from some of the words that President Trump used, I think his policy is actually not that different from what you might have seen from a President Hillary Clinton. President Obama was wedded to the nuclear deal. He made a lot of sacrifices to get that deal done, and all of the decisions he made at the end of his presidency were based on whether it would be good or bad for the deal. Neither Trump is no longer bound by that, and Hillary Clinton wouldn't have been bound by that as much either. So this tougher approach to Iran, frankly, I think is not that unusual of a U.S. policy. And I think you would have seen, and you're going to see Democrats eventually embrace this. I suspect Senator Corker's legislation is going to have strong support eventually from Senator Cardin or Senator Schumer and some of the other skeptics of Iran's role in the region.
So you're saying that there could be legislation that will be passed in Congress in the next 60 days?
I'm not sure it'll be in 60 days. There's some technical reasons to believe that 60-day window is really not that significant. The fact that Corker has introduced this bill, if he can get Democrats to come across the aisle and support him, and I think it's very likely that he will, and you're going to see a real concerted effort there, that could happen this year, and I think you could see the president sign it into law.
All right, Qinduo, if the United States reimposes sanctions on Iran, of course, China and the other signatories have no obligation to follow those sanctions at all. But the United States, as we know, is a powerful country. Could it threaten Chinese companies, Chinese banks, for instance, that do business with Iran by saying that if you continue to deal with Iran, then you can't do business with the United States?
I would say it's likely the Chinese investment and the Chinese businesses in Iran will be affected. And similarly, if you look at the European countries' trade relationship with Iran, if you look at the figures of the first half year of this year, you would see there's a jump of 94% compared with the same period last year. So obviously, with the lifting of sanctions, there's a booming business for countries, China, European countries, not that much from Russia probably. But with the reimposing of sanctions, some of them could be really biting. Basically, other banks, from other countries will be also punished if they have any dealing with the Iranians. So I think there will be a lot of pressure from the Chinese business community on the Chinese government to say no to the new sanctions, to work out a way, to fight back those sanctions. I think China will work closely with the European countries as well as Russia to make sure, the deal will continue, to make sure it will be implemented, not only by the powers but also by Iran here.
Of course, we're looking at this from the Washington view, trying to analyze it and figure out what Donald Trump is doing. But for the Iranians, at what point will the Iranians, or can the Iranians say, you're not fulfilling the terms of this deal, we're pulling out?
Yeah,
we don't think you.
That's a good point, and I'll tell you right now, there are hardliners in Iran. There's hardliners in Iran who never liked this deal. right? And now they're saying, look, you see what we said. First of all, we told you not to trust those Americans, right? But second of all, this is good because it means that this deal could collapse, and that'll be better for us in anyway. So certainly, I think as soon as you start to see, I mean, I thought the President Rouhani's statement was very interesting. He framed this in the Iranian national interest. He said that as long as the Iranian national interest is preserved, we're going to stay in this deal no matter what President Trump said. But as soon as new sanctions come on, that's the trigger, I think, where it's going to be very difficult politically for Iran to stay in the deal.
Well, that pulls the rug from under the reform part of the...
It certainly does. It certainly complicates things for Hassan. Look, Hassan Rouhani was elected in 2013. When he was running for office, he said, I have a key. And the key is unlocking all of Iran's problems. And one of the main problems, he said, was Iran's sanctions and isolation, and he would do a nuclear deal.
Right, Simon, as we heard at the beginning of the show from our reporter, the two countries are big supporters of Donald Trump in this on this particular issue, Israel and Saudi Arabia. What's the connection?
Well, I mean, there's an inevitability, right? I mean, the Israelis have been deeply oppositional towards the Iran deal from its very first moments of being mooted. They have concerns that they are directly in the line of fire of any Iranian nuclear weapon that could be developed. And the Saudis, similarly, are very eager to see Iran contained because they don't like the rise of Iran regionally. They want to be the big power regionally, and so they've been extremely concerned about that. So Donald Trump is allied on this particular issue with Israel and Saudi Arabia, the curious bedfellows there, but he's also pulling the rug out from underneath countries in Western Europe with whom the United States would be more traditionally allied. And, you know, if the United States gives the European Union, the Brits, the French, and the Germans an Iran headache, that's going to impact the broader series of bilateral relations and worsen them.
Lester, what should we be looking out for in the next 2 months, the next 60 days? Because as we heard our reporter tell us, this goes back to Congress. Congress has 60 days to respond to it.
First of all, I don't think it's 60 days. I think it's actually several months. But I do think it's important to look to Congress. Can Senator Corker and Senator Rubio and Senator Cotton, who are working with him on this bill, bring some Democrats over? I suspect if they add a provision that would allow for congressional review of presidential waivers of sanctions, which was in the original Iran Nuclear Agreement Review Act, and which was in the Iran and Russia sanctions bill that passed a couple months ago, that they could get Democrats who will come over and support the bill because it, frankly, will actually pull some power away from the executive branch and bring it back towards the legislative. And Democrats are very much in favor of that right now. So I would watch for that maneuver from Corker and Cotton and Rubio.
And Qinduo, what would the Chinese be looking for?
Well, I think the Chinese will be watching closely, you know, what's the true intention of the congressional leaders, whether they can work out a deal that will be acceptable for the Trump administration. And also, if you are working on a separate deal, that means like you are abandoning the current deal. And if you are reimposing sanctions, also it's equals to abandoning of the deal. And I'm not sure how this will be worked out. And if you return the bill, the deal to the White House, then, as Trump announced, that's, you know, he will basically walk away from the deal. So, well, we still have 2 months time to see what will be worked out.
Or longer. Qinduo Xu, Lester Munson, Simon Marks, Afshin Molavi. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Aaron Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.